Welcome to this Writing at the Edge webinar with me, Jonathan Posner, and our guest presenter, author Hazel Hatman. Now, I write action-adventure stories set in the 16th century. I was going to say Tudor England, but 16th century, with my 7th novel coming out, appropriately enough, on the 7th of March.
And I write romance, mostly romantic comedy. I have a series of Jane Austen-inspired romances, which starts with the Darcy Dilemma, and a steamy rom-com, Love, Squirrels and Other Diversions, for which I'm currently writing a follow-on, but it's all contemporary.
Thank you. So, our subject for this half-hour webinar is the art of dialogue, and we'll be discussing how to craft natural and engaging dialogue that drives the story forward and develops characters. So, at the end of the half hour, we'll be letting you know how to get hold of our free dialogue cheat sheet. So do stick around for that. It will be an invaluable aid to creating dialogue as you write. Definitely one to have by your writing desk. And if you're watching on catch up, the offer should still be valid. Okay, so let's get started with the webinar. Crucially, we both write genre fiction. That means dialogue has a prime focus in our novels.
Yes, Jonathan. Literary fiction writers can start their novels with a 4-page description of a view or a person, but our readers want more direct action and involvement right from the start. And that means dialogue.
But not from the very first line, right?
Yes, your pet hate is starting a book with speech. I have to admit, I've got a book in development, and it starts with a question being asked. You've never explained why you loathe it so much.
Well, because I believe that dialogue needs context. So, if the first thing I read is words being spoken, it leaves me floundering. Who is speaking? Why? And more importantly, why should I care? So, I find it very frustrating to read dialogue before I know anything about who is speaking. It's why the first thing we said when we first opened this webinar was to introduce ourselves. So that's why I find it frustrating. But hey, this webinar is about the art of dialogue. So what about that? Hazel, our key themes today are A, how to craft natural and engaging dialogue that B, drives the story forward, and C, develops characters. So the first of these is crafting natural and engaging dialogue. So let's start with that. What would you say is the key thing for authors to consider when writing such dialogue?
For me, it's always how to make the unnatural sound natural.
The unnatural sound natural. So what do you mean by that?
Well, it breaks down into 3 elements. First of all, as authors, we abbreviate normal dialogue. Secondly, we deliberately don't ask questions that would sink our entire story. And finally, we seamlessly need to include information that we need for the plot.
Okay, so let's start with the first one. What do you mean by abbreviating dialogue?
In normal circumstances, when we meet people, there's a whole lot of, "Hi, Jonathan, how are things?" going on. But if authors were to do this, their readers' attention would wander off to whether they had any chocolate chip cookies left in the cupboard, and they'd put down the book and never pick it back up again.
But they would pick up the chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
I know I would.
Yes.
So, in that respect, what you're saying here is that greetings are bad.
Except
Okay.
when you need them. Sometimes you need them to introduce a person in a way that indicates their character traits. Here's a bit of dialogue. When a girl called Amanda meets a man in a bar. "I'm Amanda," she said. "Amanda," he purred. "I'm Rafe." Or, "It's Ralph," he snapped. Or, "Rafferty Ponsonby Smythe," he drawls. 3 introductions, creating 3 entirely different characters in your head.
Okay, I get it. So basically what we're saying here is that Rafe is a smooth talker.
He's
so
a
I'm imagining a smooth guy. Okay. And then Ralph is quite short in, he's quite aggressive. He's quite
A
sort
billionaire
of...
banker, maybe.
Okay. And then Rafferty Ponsonby Smythe, I'm imagining somebody who's very upper class. He may even have a monocle. We're seeing some... So 3 guys, all with roughly the same name, but we're getting 3 different characters.
Personally, I wouldn't want to date any of them, but yeah.
I understand, but there you go. Okay, so what about the next point? Deliberately not asking questions that would sink the story.
You see this a lot in crime novels, but it also creeps into your genre and my genre. The thing is, when it's done well by the author, you barely notice it. Take a second chance romance where the hero and heroine meet again after some intervening years.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot of history between them, upon which you're going to build an entire story. But that story fails if one of them says, "So why did you dump me all those years ago?" The challenge is to write an entire dialogue of them meeting again without that crucial sentence.
Even though the reader will know that that's the sort of the elephant in the room. That's the thing that neither of them is actually able to say.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
That actually contributes to the curiosity gap, though. If you never actually give that information until right near the end,
right,
that you never actually understand why someone got dumped by the other.
So you're using the dialogue there to almost set up the hook that holds you keeps you in the story.
Yes.
Okay. So now your final point of the 3 that you mentioned was about seamlessly including information that is needed for the plot. As a historical novelist, I can sometimes struggle with this.
It's about backstory, like many romance writers. I use dialogue to give backstory. Having characters discuss their past is a natural way to get their histories in, either together or apart. It feels real when they talk about things that happened and how they felt. But you say as a historical novelist, you struggle with it.
I do, as I need to be very mindful of the historical setting. In your kind of contemporary romance, the reader is generally aware of the customs and norms of your society, because we're all part of the same society. It's what we know. So when the character talks about them, the reader is already on the same page, so to speak. But in a historical novel, there may be norms and customs that the reader is not aware of. So I'm very wary of using dialogue to put such things across, because I think it really lacks credibility. If you've got 2 characters explaining something to each other, just so that the reader knows about it, well, if it's something that would be common knowledge, it just comes across as really clunky.
Have you got an example?
Well, yeah, I do actually. Okay. So if I wanted to get across the details of, say, how clothes were cleaned in a Tudor noble's house, having one Tudor character explain it to another just wouldn't work. It would be something that they would both be perfectly well aware of.
But you could have one servant say to the other, "Take this washing to the laundry and don't forget the urine."
Yeah, because that's how they washed clothes. They used urine, which is lovely when you think about it.
Yeah.
And smelly as well. But anyway, there you are. They washed the clothes. They rinsed them very thoroughly afterwards. But yeah, it's quite an effective way to actually get them clean. But yes, you're absolutely right. You could do it that way. If that dialogue comes across as natural, if it would be part of the way that they would talk to each other, then it allows the reader to infer what's actually going on without telling them. So, I mean, to give you an idea of what I would say is how it doesn't work, is if in a modern day contemporary novel, 2 characters explain to each other how a mobile phone or a smartphone, how it works. Well, they'd know about that already.
But you could get around that, Jonathan, if you have a character explain to their granny how to use a smartphone.
Okay, so if it sounds normal and natural, if it's part of everyday conversation, then yes, I totally accept that can work.
Is there a time when you would use dialogue to explain something?
Yes, absolutely. If there's something that's new news, then if I wanted someone to say, for example, know the outcome of a battle, then having somebody coming in, having a character come in and announce it, would actually be perfectly valid.
Okay. So those are my 3 key elements for writers to consider to make dialogue sound natural: abbreviating normal dialogue, avoiding questions that would sink the entire story and seamlessly including information you need for the plot. Do you have any?
Yes, I avoid overusing names because, as you know, Hazel, we don't normally use people's names, Hazel, when we're speaking to them, do we, Hazel? It sounds forced and unnatural, doesn't it? So, but using it sparingly, Hazel, can give emphasis to a piece of dialogue, or it can give menace, like in a Bond film, you know, hey, Mr. Bond. You know, the way that they use the name, almost to sort of, the fact that he knows the name makes it quite menacing. But generally, I avoid it if I can. I rely on my speech tags to let people know who is talking.
Speech tags, I call them attributions. He said, she said. They're really important, and if you don't use them well, or at all, it can spoil the reader's enjoyment.
Yeah, that's true. If a reader can't easily work out who is speaking, they have to come out of the flow, and that sort of takes them out of the book, as it were, and then they're less likely to finish it after that.
Sometimes I get so carried away with dialogue, I find I've written pages of it with no attributions at all. So I have to spend quite a lot of time going back, editing my first draft and putting all that stuff in.
Yeah, some writers love editing, but I know you hate it.
Yeah, I do hate editing. But with dialogue, I have a guideline that someone once gave me, and I would credit them here if I could remember who they were, but sadly I can't. All I can remember is their rule.
Okay, so what's the rule?
It's quite simple. 3 lines of dialogue, some interiority. 5 lines of dialogue, some exteriority.
That sounds interesting. Okay, can you give us an example of that?
Yeah. Okay, here's some simple dialogue. No. Yes. But. He knew. He knew all along. Becomes. No. Yes. But. She paused as she worked out all the ramifications in her head. Her heart sank. He knew. He knew all along. She lifted her head. It seemed wrong that the sun was still shining through the window, reflecting on the myriad of shiny surfaces. Perhaps she could blame the glare for the tears forming in her eyes.
So the pause was the interior... No, wait a minute. Is that right? The pause was her working out all the ramifications.
That's
her heart
the
sank. That's the interiority.
interiority.
Okay. And she lifted her head. It seemed wrong. All of that. That was the exteriority.
Yes, you're giving it some context as to where it's happening, how it's happening.
Okay. So, and all of that's built into the dialogue so that the dialogue actually is richer and more well developed.
Yes, but I add them after I've written all the dialogue.
Okay. Yeah, I do that as well, actually. I call it colouring in. When I go back through the dialogue I've written and then sort of work out a little bit more about what was going on whilst that dialogue was taking place. Okay. Do you always use that?
Not always, but often enough. It's important to have attributions, otherwise what you have is a play, not a novel. Are you consistent with where you put the speech tags? Like, do you always put the speech tag at the end of a sentence?
No. I like to vary it. It keeps it feeling fresh. So sometimes the attribution goes at the end. Sorry, I'll start that again. Sometimes the attribution goes at the start. There you go. Joe said, let's go for a walk. Sometimes, this is it goes at the end. Let's go for a walk, Joe said. But sometimes it goes in the middle, and I use that to emphasise the beat. Let's go out, Joe said, for a walk.
I know you use Joe every time there. You've said you shouldn't overuse names within speech, but what about in speech tags? When should you use a character's name, and when should you use the pronoun instead?
Well, it's all about balance. Too many pronouns can leave the reader confused, especially if your characters are all men or all women. So when he or she could refer to more than one character. You need to have a mix of pronouns, names, and no tag at all, just so that basically the reader knows who is talking, but without being hit over the head with all of these tags. One thing to remember though, a pronoun generally refers to the subject person of a sentence. So if you're using pronouns, don't confuse the reader by switching character. Here's an example of what I mean. Derek smiled as Robert lifted his glass. Let's raise a toast, he said. Who does he refer to here?
Ooh. Derek, because he's the subject of the sentence?
Yes, but it could be Robert, because he's the one raising the glass.
I see what you mean. Confusing.
So what I try and do is reread the dialogue as I edit and ask myself, would the reader know who is talking here? And I don't just assume that they would, because I do. Just because I know who's talking doesn't necessarily mean the reader does as well.
I guess you could do the same by reading it to someone.
Yes. Or there's even a speech thing. If you write in Scrivener or in Word like I do, there's a little speech thing which reads it for you. It's a bit mechanical, but it can. Excuse me. It's a bit mechanical, but it can be a way of actually getting a good read on the sound of the dialogue. So now let's move on to the second part of our topic, dialogue that moves the story forward. So what would you say are the ways that dialogue can do this?
I would say the main ones are advancing the plot by revealing new information, or exposing secrets, or driving characters to take actions. And building tension, of course. And revealing conflict, often by using deep subtext to expose the difference between what they say and what they mean. And, of course, what they do.
Absolutely. So characters, very often, they'll say something and mean something completely different. And it's the skill of the writer to be able to make that work without actually being too obvious about it. I can certainly see that. But okay, so revealing new information, how does that work?
So in romance, one character revealing their feelings for another. Once it's out there, there's no way things can be the same again. A piece of dialogue like that can even become an inciting incident, the thing that turns the whole plot.
Yeah, that's true. So the inciting incident doesn't have to be purely action, something happening. It could be something that somebody said. And we've all said things that at the moment they've left our mouths, we've realised they were the wrong thing to say. But that can turn the plot of the entire book as the inciting incident. What's the thing that's just been said cannot be unsaid.
But sometimes a secret is revealed. As the plot progresses, conversations can reveal things like important decisions or conflicts or new obstacles preventing the protagonist achieving their goal.
Okay. And talking of conflicts, there's the other point that you mentioned just now, building tension to reveal conflict. You can have arguments or misunderstandings or untruths, especially where the reader, as I was saying just now, the reader can see that the character is lying.
Oh, we don't lie in romance novels. But you're right, we have lots of misunderstandings. And I do so love the banter of an argument.
So what we're talking about here a lot about this is subtext. Revealing the deep undercurrents, maybe of resentment or of conflict or something along those lines. All of which turns the plot and drives the narrative forward from the dialogue that we're reading. So we've got natural dialogue that drives the story forward. Can we now look at how dialogue can develop character?
Knowing a person's motivations, hidden desires, traits, values and personality tells the reader so much about their character and therefore makes sense of their actions and reactions. Say my heroine is out on a date with a billionaire. They meet someone else. If my billionaire asks for an introduction or remembers a name from a past introduction, it says good things. If he ignores them, it says bad things. We see, just from this piece of dialogue, that he's either a nice character or a nasty one. And this helps move the plot forward, because the way he acts, the person he is, has a direct impact on what happens.
Absolutely, especially if he's a billionaire. And we see so often that it's about how people treat others that says about them. So, you know, I've heard about people who, when they go out on an interview and get taken for lunch, it's how they treat the waiter that tells the interviewer what kind of person they actually are. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing you've mentioned there. We know from the way this billionaire acts towards other people
A third party.
A third party, what kind of person he is. And especially if that person, that third party, is of lower status than him, which presumably as a billionaire one would assume they are, then the way he treats that person tells us so much about him as a character. So, I totally get that, yeah. Okay, so, sum up. The way that a character talks tells us a lot about them. But for me, this is about the beats in their speech. So every conversation has its beats, and one of the key ones is a pause. A pause creates emphasis because it focuses attention back onto what was just said before the pause. And continually writing he paused or she paused or whatever is both repetitive and actually slightly clunky. So using a speech tag to emphasize that is the beat, that beat is the pause, but by doing it with a speech tag, that really works for me.
Have you got an example?
Yeah, okay, I'll give you an example. If I may, I will take one from the new book that's coming out on the 7th of March. Just mentioning that, putting it out there. So this is where a speech tag signifies a pause for emphasis. You might be able to help me, he said. Or in truth, a friend of mine. She is in the gravest of need. Indeed, I replied. What is that? Tell me so I can decide if I can help. In both speeches, the he said, I replied creates a natural beat, and that gives the pause, and that gives the emphasis to the words just spoken. So the indeed, I replied, really focuses your attention on the indeed, and it signifies where the character would have taken a breath. Indeed. What is that? So for me, that works really well.
Okay. Can a character's actions within the speech do the same thing?
Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to give you another example from the same book, which, as I may have mentioned, comes out on the March the 7th. The food you eat here in England, he said, staring at the pie when it was put before him, I would not feed to the poorest peasant in my land. We find it most wholesome, I observed. But tell me, do you not have such pies in your country? We do, he said, pushing his knife through the crust and gazing sombrely at the steaming filling. But it is not what I would eat. So the actions of staring at the pie and then pushing his knife through the crust not only tell the reader what is actually happening, but also emphasises the natural beats and the pauses of the conversation. They make it easier for the reader not only to hear the voices, but also to see the scene more clearly. And that, of course, helps build a much clearer picture of the characters and what is happening.
Okay. What else about dialogue can give an insight into character?
Well, it's the classic thing that we all learn as writers. Show, don't tell. Show how a character thinks and behaves through the things that they say and the words that they use. It's like your billionaire being nice to the waiter. That shows what kind of person they are. Let the reader see the character's inner world and emotional state through what they say, through their dialogue.
So, for example, how a character speaks in different situations can reveal their values, the emotional depth, and even the conflicts within themselves, helping readers to understand them on a deeper level. Here's an example about a character who rambles on and on. Could they be nervous? Are they trying to fill a silence? What are they uncomfortable about?
While there's one who speaks in short, clipped sentences. They might be feeling defensive. Or maybe they're hiding something.
What other examples do you have?
Well, in The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, Holden Caulfield's dialogue is filled with slang and sarcasm and cynicism, which maybe shows his inner turmoil and how he is disillusioned with the adult world. His speech is often dismissive, and he constantly refers to things and people as phony. Perhaps this reveals his deep conflict over losing his childhood, and therefore his need to protect his younger sister, Phoebe, and her innocence. People never notice anything, he says, showing how he feels about the phoniness that he sees in other people. Now, contrast that with the calm, measured speech of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. He says, You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. It shows how empathetic he is, while his calm tone says he has a steadiness about him, a strong moral compass.
Of course, one of my favourites is Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. She's fiercely independent, confident and determined to marry for love, not social standing. And we know this from her refusal of Darcy's proposal, when she says, "From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain for the feelings of others." This speech is brilliant. And then she goes on to say she wouldn't marry him. She could not be prevailed upon to marry him, were he the last man.
Well, she needs to get off the fence and say what she really thinks.
Yes, but we understand her character so well
Yeah.
from that speech. It's so brilliant. My daughter's got a scarf with a speech written on it.
Oh, right.
That I gave her as a Christmas present one year.
And does she refer to it on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, they might have taken it off her in a GCSE exam.
Yes, quite well, she'd get accused of cheating. Yes, I get that. Well, I mean, it seems to me that Lizzie Bennet is a very strong, firm character, and we see that absolutely through her speech. It also sets up the premise of the book, and I'm going to admit now I haven't actually read Pride and Prejudice. No, don't go there.
Have you at least watched the movies?
Probably at some point. But I've forgotten what I was going to say now. But essentially, it shows that we're going to go into enemies into lovers territory.
Yeah.
So we're setting up the enemies bit at the beginning and showing her as a character, so that when we get towards the end and they become the lovers, then it shows that she has developed and changed in order to understand him better, and presumably he's done the same.
Yes.
Okay, so now we have looked at A, how to craft natural and engaging dialogue that B, drives the story forward, and C, develops characters. Is there anything else we should mention before we wrap up?
I would only add that character development is important. Having them grow and develop as the plot progresses, as they realise the changes imposed on them by the challenges they face.
Yeah, so it's a bit like Lizzie Bennet, as you've just said, that she starts the book, we see her very firm and very set in her ways and very determined, and by the end of the book she's grown and developed into a different sort of person. I'm having not read Pride and Prejudice, I'm not going to go into any more detail than that.
We'll let you off scot-free there, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll have to go and read it, or watch the film, or read the summary.
You'll get sucked in. Watch the film.
Okay, I'll watch the film.
The BBC version.
Okay, is that the good one?
That's the best, but
Is that the one with Colin Firth?
That's the one with Colin Firth, yes.
Coming out of the
yes,
lake.
with the wet shirt. Oh,
Yes, okay, not going there. Okay.
It's down to your preparation and initial understanding of your characters. A lot of writers do a character sketch, setting out each one's backstory, their physical characteristics and their way of speaking. Some even write sample dialogue for the character as part of a sketch, so that they can get the speech patterns buttoned down before they start writing.
Well, that's a good suggestion. And I know of writers who have a picture of their characters up by their desk whilst they write. So they've got a constant point of reference as they develop their characters. They've got something, visual to look at. Absolutely.
And a written character arc showing how they grow and develop also helps.
Yeah, I can agree with that. But I am a bit of a pantser myself, which means that I basically make the plot up as I go along. But it really helps to know my characters, because by knowing the characters, they can really help me develop the plot. There are things that the characters almost tell me that they would or they wouldn't do. And that really helps have the character to develop the plot. I need to know how they would react to each other in certain situations. And if I put something, I put a situation together that doesn't quite work, the characters almost let me know by going off and doing something else. So it really works that way as a pantser for me to understand my characters. Maybe not with a full character sketch up front, but I know them well enough in my head to be able to work with them, as it were. But as we said earlier, it's how plot builds through character.
Writers often say that it's the characters who write the book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I think that brings you and me to the end of the webinar. Let me give you some information on our next webinar. This will be broadcast on the 6th of March, and it will be on overcoming writer's block, strategies for breaking through creative barriers. So do tune in for that. The ticket link is on screen now.
It looks fascinating, Jonathan.
Thank you. And finally, if I may, a quick word about our partner. Writing at the Edge is partnered with Winter and Drew Publishing, which aims to bring together the best of self-publishing and the best of traditional publishing. So, should you submit queries to agents and go down the traditional publishing route? Or should you go down the self-publishing route? Well, with Winter and Drew's innovative hybrid publishing approach, you can have the best of both worlds. You can find out more on the website, and that is on screen now.
And a final thought, we've discussed some good tips in this webinar. Can viewers get hold of them?
Yes, they can. We have a cheat sheet available, and that can be downloaded for free. So that link is on the screen right now. So, finally, it's a thank you from both of us, and to the team behind the camera, that's Keith and Jason. Thank you for giving us your time and for watching the webinar, and we hope you found it useful. And Hazel, many thanks indeed for coming in. It's been really great to have your thoughts and your insight on dialogue.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed it. Goodbye.
Goodbye.